Greville Lindon, whom I first met when I went to this very day, or 27 I'm sure it'll be, at the Meditatio Centre in London. And it was so scintillating that before the end of the day I'd already asked him if he would come and do the same thing in Oxford. So here he is. He has more than one string to his bow. He's an accomplished poet, and he knows a lot about Charles Williams, Yeats. There's a Yeats Day in the autumn at the Meditatio Centre. He's got some poems that have been set to music, and there will be a Hollywood music room in March. There's supplies outside. So don't be shy, Greville, in telling us about your different interests. But Blake is certainly one of the top people for Greville, and I was bowled over, as I hope you will be, by the breadth of this man's accomplishments. I don't think Greville, I mean Blake. His art, his poetry, his engravings, stunning, and a very interesting person, I would say, no more than that at the moment. So, without any further ado, are you all happy about the sound? It'll be better coming from the microphone over there, I suspect, than this. But do wave your hand, please, if you can't hear. And is the lighting all right? Yes. Okay, I didn't want it to be too bright. I didn't want you to be able to see. I'll turn it up a little bit. Yes, I'll turn it up a little. But anyway, and my husband Ben, who is my right-hand man, disappearing into the sunset already. But I hope he's going to... Oh, thank you. Thanks very much. Yes. Is that better?
It's better to know.
Yes.
Were you going to tell us where the fire exits are?
I wasn't. Because, I mean, basically, you just go out the way you came.
There is another on there.
Yes.
Thank you.
But I'm not anticipating a fire. I'm anticipating rain and wind. I have brought 3 spare umbrellas. But at lunchtime we'll be able to use the Reynolds room, which is just a few metres away, and the foyer in here for lunch. And if it is fine enough, do look at the gardens. They are so fascinating and intriguing.
And the chapel.
And the chapel, yes. But this is a lovely space, and some wonderful things are going to unfold. So, without any more ado, welcome and enjoy your day. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I hope you can all hear me. Hopefully the microphone is working, and now I just have to see if I can populate the pictures and get us on the right track for the next bit. Have a look. Yes. I just thought we'd start off with this glorious balletic image of Blake's, sometimes called Albion Arose, sometimes called Glad Day. As with many of Blake's most vivid graphic images, it doesn't have a specific title. It's one that was sometimes produced as a separate print and sometimes as the frontispiece to one of his longer poems. Of course, it does it a slight disservice to blow it up to this enormous size, because actually the original is about the size of a postcard, and so it looks rather more sort of textured and slightly heavy-handed when it's enlarged to this scale, but nonetheless it's a lovely radiant picture, and it shows, I think, not only the exuberance and enthusiasm with which Blake viewed life, and in particular human form, you know, as he says, the human form divine, but also the relationship which his work, often on a small scale, has to the very grand tradition of artists like Michelangelo. He is, in a sense, a Renaissance artist also beyond his time. So, if technology permitting, we'll... No, that's not... I'll try using this thing. I think this is probably better. Yes, here we are. Okay, so here's our title. And, yes, and here's the man himself. This is the Thomas Phillips portrait, which I love, actually. It's a conventional portrait, but I think it's delightful. It shows Blake the artist. He's got his pencil in one hand, and the eyes cast a little bit upwards, and you feel the imagination is working. He's seeing something. He's about to produce a great work. And I think it's very sweet, really, because Blake wasn't the easiest of people, and he certainly wasn't the most conventional of artists. And of course, Thomas Phillips, a fairly ordinary but skillful portrait painter, but clearly Phillips has seen something in Blake. He's appreciated him. He's liked him. And so he gives him dignity, he gives him grandeur and enthusiasm, and we feel this is a chap we could have talked to, we could have listened to him, It's a living picture. Now, if you want to see deeper into Blake, brace yourselves for quite almost a shock, at least an impact, because here is Blake, drawn by Blake. Look at those eyes. This is a drawing which was only really discovered quite recently, I mean within the last 20 years or so. And for much of that time there was debate as to whether this was actually a self-portrait or not. I mean, my feeling is that you've only got to look at this to be pretty sure that Blake drew it. There are not many artists who could somehow, in a relatively realistic portrait, convey that extraordinary intensity and those hypnotic eyes. It has indeed been identified as a self-portrait by a brilliant piece of detective work, which was one of the American Blake scholars. I think it might have been Robert Essick or George Bentley, G.E. Bentley, carefully compared this portrait with other known portraits of Blake, and they detected that there was there was a little crease on one side of the face near the chin. There's a slightly asymmetrical mark on the forehead. And they realised that in this portrait, those features have been flipped. They've been reversed. And what that tells you is that this was done in a mirror. And nobody draws a portrait in a mirror unless they're drawing themselves. So there's no question that this is a self-portrait by Blake. And, well, if you want to encounter him as a person, there he is. Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? But we can see, in a sense, further into Blake's understanding of himself. Because we also have what you might call a visionary self-portrait, or an even more visionary self-portrait, which might be thought of as Blake seeing himself perhaps as Adam was the universal man. And that is this. Recognisably, again, the same person, but now I think viewed as a figure, perhaps in the Garden of Eden, surrounded by nature. You've got horses, you've got sheep, you've got foliage above, the same eyes, but now the figure is the face and the neck and so on, both powerful and youthful. And this is, I think, the inner Blake. This is the spiritual Blake, if you like. So here's Blake as you might have met him went on a very intense day, and here is Blake in his own imagination. None of these pictures are very well known. They're not often shown, but I think they're really worth contemplating if you want to get to know the man. Stepping back from, if you like, the inner life of Blake, let's think of him in terms of history. it can be difficult to get a sense of quite when he lived. So I find a very useful way of getting a handle on Blake in his period is to realise that his life coincides neatly with that of Jane Austen. In fact, Blake's life, if you look at those dates, you'll see that he kind of brackets the life of Jane Austen. He was born a bit before her, and he died 10 years after her. You couldn't have, in one way, two more diverse authors. Utterly, I mean, it's hard to imagine them in the same room. And yet there's no reason why they shouldn't actually have met at some stage in the same room. And of course, one of the great things that is between them is simply the social distance of class. In Jane Austen, you have an author who comes from the gentry, the sort of the borderline between the middle class and the lower aristocracy. And in Blake, you have the skilled craftsman and small shopkeeper class of London, but both living at the same time, both living in the same country, with many of the same forces at work. And for Blake, the key things that were going on in society, the essential forces at work, the things that had a huge impact on him, were, you'll probably notice this thing too, I have an awful tendency to divide everything into twos, so we've got two authors here. Here what I see is the two main forces acting upon Blake from the outer society, and these are political revolution in the form of the French Revolution of 1789 and the wars that followed. It's worth remembering that the central decades of Blake's life were occupied by enormous political turmoil, warfare of revolution on the continent, and a ferment of radical ideas in Britain, with the government trying to keep the stopper down on any possibility of radicalism and revolution in Britain. And at the same time, the development of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, from the 1780s through to the 1830s, which is very soon after Blake's death, you had the transformation of Britain, really, from a rural agricultural country into the hub of industrialism, which then spread throughout the world, and you had cities like Birmingham and Manchester transformed into really hellish centres of heavy industry, pollution, and disease, into which surplus agricultural population crowded. So that it was a period of enormous turmoil, and if Blake's ideas often seem radical, disturbing, sometimes even confused and desperate, I think this is why. I mean, I think it's hard for us to imagine what it must have been like to live through a period when the foundations of society and all the assumptions of the governing classes were utterly transformed, as they were between 1789 and the end of the 1820s. So these should give us some broad sense of the kind of time in which Blake was living. Now, Blake was born in London, which was a much smaller city than it is now. He was born to fairly poor parents. His father ran a hosier's and glovers shop, so they sold stockings and gloves and other small articles of apparel. They were, they were reasonably off, but not particularly prosperous. Perhaps more importantly, they were mystical Christians. Now, one of the great frustrations for people studying Blake's life is that nobody has been able to find out what his parents' religious beliefs were. There have been all kinds of arguments about this. We know that at one stage his parents joined the Swedenborgian church, the followers of Emanuel Swedenborg, about who will say more. But they were also involved in other things, or at least one other religious organisation. It was a mystical organisation. It was a church of some sort that clearly had visionary and mystical beliefs based on close reading of the Bible and probably a lot of attention to the book of Revelations and that kind of thing. People have tried to argue that they were Muggletonians, or that they were, you know, many radical working class Christian sects had survived from the period of the Civil War and were still going strong. Basically, people who met in one another's houses, read the Bible closely, probably believed in personal inspiration and interpretation of scriptures, and would have encouraged the having of visions and the dreaming of dreams. But we don't know really what his parents believed. There was that kind of background, clearly, and there was an involvement with the thought of Emanuel Swedenborg. More than that, we don't know. What we do know is that Blake had an absolutely encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. And the most unexpected biblical references crop up in his writings, making it clear that he knew the Bible, you know, inside out, in a way that very few people do nowadays. The other, sorry, this serpent-like microphone is sort of pouncing on it if I get in the wrong angle. Anyway, okay, so we have that background. We have a background which encourages imagination, vision of a spiritual kind. But Blake clearly had a particularly strong imaginative faculty. The best guess about this would be, I think, to say that for Blake, he could mentally visualize things which were virtually as visible to him as the supposedly objective world that we see with our physical eyes. There are people like this. I've been working on Yeats recently, and the Irish poet George Russell was another one. There are people around who will be able to see things in the imagination, and they are just as vivid as what we are. Maybe there's somebody here in the audience right now, as what we're seeing with our physical eyes. So his visual imagination was always very intense, and he developed it and he encouraged it, and he also wanted to encourage it in other people. So we'll come back to that later on. But Blake very much believed that vision was important and that vision was something that should be shared. I don't know, has anybody here heard the name of Henri Corbin at all? And if you come across the word imaginal, the idea of the imaginal world, the idea of the use of visualization in spiritual practices, we know about that, don't we? Because Ignatius Loyola and others have talked about it. For Blake, this was an important path, and so he will talk a lot about vision, and among other things, he does literally mean seeing things, and seeing things mentally. Now, the reason for this enormous digression I've just made is to say that this played a significant part in his childhood. Between the ages of 8 and 10, he came in to tell his mother one day that he...
Oh, gosh, sorry.
God.
Oh my goodness.
No, what's happened? Oh, it's all right. I don't know what happened. Too much energy. Demons and the angels are interfering. I don't know. I was about to say that Blake, yes, it seems to be fine. I haven't blown the college up. Between the ages of 8 and 10, at some point, Blake came in to tell his mother that he had seen a tree full of angels on Peckham Rye. So, no doubt, had his mother gone out, she would have seen the tree. Whether she would have been able to see the angels, I don't know. But for Blake, as a child, with that child's spontaneous, perhaps eidetic imagery, there was the tree, and the tree was full of angels. What a glorious sight. I mean, this is of course, a much later image of Blake's, and it represents Jacob's ladder. But I thought we should have some angels, and there they are. Now, on that occasion, Blake's father wanted to beat him for telling lies, but his mother intervened and protected him. So you can see that the parents weren't always at one about how to treat Blake's visionary gift as a child. Perhaps an anxiety that he might be a bit odd. Not the first time that this was said about Blake, or the last, of course. And on another occasion, he reported that he had seen angels walking amongst the haymakers at their work. And now you see a few, as I said that, and I'll say it again, he saw angels amongst the haymakers at their work. Now, for a moment, you get a mental image of that, don't you? You picture that. Just imagine that much, much stronger, and there's what Blake saw, and what a beautiful image. You can see the combination almost of the pastoral tradition and the spiritual vision coming together, and almost, that's an image from Blake's childhood, and yet you can see the work of one of his disciples like Samuel Palmer already in embryo at that moment, can't you? That kind of creativity where the pastoral and the spiritual are blended is already there in Blake as a child. And on another occasion, it wasn't always pleasant because he screamed, because he said he'd seen God putting his head to the window. And he was terrified. I guess it must have been an enormous head, So these experiences weren't just pretty fantasies, they were also at times deeply disturbing. And of course Blake, as we shall see, had a vision of horror and of terrible things as well as beautiful things. It wasn't always pretty. Blake's schooling, let's have God putting his head to the window, there we are, that's again of course a later image, but and Blake didn't always see God in this form, but this is one way in which Blake can visualise God in his mature work. This is, I think, the Lord answering Job out of the whirlwind. It's a much later picture. But, so if that appeared full size at the window, a small child would be frightened. Blake didn't fit in at school. He went to a conventional school briefly, but he hated it because the children were beaten, which of course is completely normal educational practice in the 1760s. Knowledge was whipped into you. But he refused to go. His parents responded sympathetically, and from the age of 10 he was sent to a drawing school. Instead, apparently you could go to art school at the age of 10. He went to Mr. Parr's drawing school, and among other things he was sent out to draw the carvings on the tombs in Westminster Abbey. And he became very, very enthusiastic about Gothic art, and in fact always believed throughout his life that Gothic art was the true Christian art. So that had a deep impact on him. And of course this was the period, we're talking about the 1760s now, this was the sort of period when the Gothic was being rediscovered anyway. You've got the foundations of what we think of as Romanticism being laid. So earlier in the 18th century, Gothic was a term of insult. It meant ignorant, it meant crude, it meant unsophisticated. But as the 18th century went on, Gothic came to mean beautiful, delicate, spiritual, and something that we could aspire to. And of course you've got God of Revival eventually, and Strawberry Hill and all those things. So Blake is very much, without knowing it, of course, part of that, even from his childhood. London, as I said, was much smaller then than it is now, and so as a London child he would not have been entirely out of touch with visions of the pastoral. You will possibly remember hearing an often quoted passage from Jerusalem, one of the little songs in Jerusalem. It says, "The fields from Islington to Marylebone, from Primrose Hill to St. John's Wood, were builded over with pillars of gold, and there Jerusalem's pillars stood." You notice the fields from Islington to Marylebone. Where are they now? They've all been built on. But at this time, you didn't have to go very far from central London to find yourself in the fields, and you could see haymakers and so on. So we're dealing with a much smaller city. And of course, the city did explode during his lifetime, but in his childhood, it was still a smaller place. From his teens onward, in fact, from the age of 12, Blake had ambitions as a poet. And when he was approaching his 20th year, he was taken up by a small circle of London cultured people who clubbed together to publish a little pamphlet of his poems called Poetical Sketches. Poetical Sketches contains some lovely early poems of Blake, the ones that he was writing really before the more famous songs of Innocence. But he didn't have a rich patron, which he would have needed at that time. I mean, had he had a rich patron, he could have made his way as an artist and poet much more easily, because this was the period when you had ploughman poets, you had people like, slightly later, like John Clare and Robert Bloomfield, peasant poets, or there was even a footman poet who'd been a servant, and these people could find a rich patron and become well known. Blake didn't have a rich patron, so he had to make his own way. He had to make a living, and he, having a marvelous talent for drawing, he became a professional engraver. Now, an engraver, which would involve engraving on copper or steel plate, was not regarded as being a fine artist. Nowadays, if somebody's an engraver on copper plate and so on, an etcher, we would regard them as a fine artist. In the 18th century, an engraver was simply part of the printing process. His job was to copy other people's designs onto copper plates so that they could be printed. Basically, he was one grade up from a printer. So it was a skilled craft rather than a fine art. And to supplement his income and develop his career, Blake opened up a print shop in joint business with his brother Robert. Here is an image of Robert. I don't think you would recognise him if you met him this time. This is actually a plate out of Blake's epic Milton, and it shows there's a corresponding plate, as it were, with the posture reversed in the same poem, which is labelled William. So William and Robert are both there. But William loved his brother Robert very much, and in this picture he shows a star falling and striking him on the right foot, and this is actually mentioned in the poem. So I think there was a divine inspiration descending on Robert as well. Now, Robert is also an artist, And there are quite a number of drawings by him, and interestingly, there are also drawings of which nobody knows whether they were done by William Blake or by Robert Blake, because you probably, if you saw the Tate exhibition, you probably saw a few of these, because their work is very, very similar. And it makes you wonder what did we lose because Robert Blake died young. So maybe there was another one, maybe two Blakes who might have diverged in different ways as great artists. We don't know. Robert Blake didn't live long enough to develop his promise. But they established a print shop together. Robert died in 1787 when William was 30, and William Blake recorded that he saw his brother's spirit leaving his body, and he said, clapping its hands for joy. So, however much he missed his brother, he clearly saw his brother's spirit also as liberated from the body into something better. So he sees his brother's spirit leaving the body, clapping his hands for joy. I can't help thinking about Yeats, on whom I'm working at the moment. If you know that late poet Yeats, you'll remember an aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered cloak upon coat upon a stick, and their soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing. Now, where did that image come from? Well, of course, Yeats knew Blake by heart. Soul clapping its hands. He's thinking of Robert Blake and the spirit leaving the body, clapping its hands. So a little bit of Blake coming into Yeats at that point. Well, so the print shop didn't flourish, particularly once Robert was gone. So the business was closed down. And William Blake resigned himself to being an independent engraver and artist. Now, he had, as we know, ambitions as a poet. He'd already had this little book of poetical sketches printed by his patrons. As a professional engraver, he realised that he could make his own books. And this, if you like, is the fundamental breakthrough in his career. Blake finds a wholly original way of producing, multiplying and marketing his work. And here we are, here's a title page from Songs of Innocence, 1789. It might sound straightforward to say, well, he's an engraver, he can make his own books. But how did he actually do it? Well, I think he wanted to keep the whole process of making the book under his own control. It would have been expensive and difficult to get someone else to produce the books, and he didn't have the money anyway. Having an engraving press, which was basically a thing a bit like a mangle with rollers, and you would sandwich your copper plate between sheets of paper and blankets, and then you would press the whole thing through these rollers, having smeared it with ink, and your printed plate would come out the other side. But Blake wanted, clearly, to combine text, words, and images, all in the one integrated design. The wonderful thing about Blake's illuminated books, as he called them, is that they don't separate the text and the design. The whole thing is completely organically integrated. Illuminated books was his own title for them, and you can see already that there's a certain depth from the Middle Ages to the medieval manuscript. They're not just illustrated. For Blake, they're illuminated, they're lit up, they have something in common with the sacred art of the Middle Ages. There's a complete overflow between text and picture. How were they made? You clearly couldn't do anything like this by a traditional basic engraving technique, so Blake invented his own method. He devised the idea of using I'll step back for a moment and say that most engraving on copper, which is what Blake used, would have been done by scratching on the copper with a needle through. You put a resist, you paint it with a thing that's going to be acid resistant, then you scratch through it with a point. You stick it in the acid, and the acid will bite into the plate. So basically it creates trenches in the plate into which the ink will stick when you want to print it. Blake's approach was completely different. He devised a method whereby he could write or paint or draw directly onto the copper plate with an acid-resistant liquid. He had a mixture of gum and various alkaline substances, which he could use a paintbrush to paint, he could use a pen to write, and design and produce the whole image, including the words. It wouldn't have been coloured at this stage, it would be monochrome, it would just be a single thing, which could be coloured afterwards. But of course, if you think about it for a moment, the logical difficulty with this is that if you write on your copper plate, however beautifully, you turn it over to print it, and your printed page is going to come out with all the words back to front. So you've got to write everything backwards. And it's funny. I mean, the things that happen with scholarship are often quite amusing. For virtually a century, scholars scratched their heads and came up with the most elaborate ideas about how did Blake get his text inverted so it would print the right way when his plates were put through the press. And there were all kinds of ideas. Transfers were a popular idea. He wrote it one way, then he transferred it, and then the plate was turned over and the words were again sort of inverted once more. Of course, the answer is perfectly simple. Eventually people found out that in the 18th century, engravers were taught to write backwards. Any engraver worth his salt could write just as fluently backwards as he could forwards. You know, it sounds difficult, doesn't it? But actually, you know, the human brain is incredible. If that's what you need to do, and you're apprenticed for 7 years, you know, by the end of 7 years, you'll be writing backwards beautifully. And that's what Blake did. He wrote backwards. And if you look carefully at lots and lots of engraved prints, not Blake's, but just ordinary ones, every so often you'll spot the odd letter or word that's the wrong way around. Of course, that's because it's a slip. And the engraver's momentarily forgotten that he's meant to be writing backwards. Anyway, so Blake would write and draw onto his copper plate with his acid-resistant gummy medium, with his pen and so on. And of course, you could scratch things out, you could dab them in again, you could add things, you could take things out. It's a very flexible method. Then he would bung it into the acid tray, bite into the surface. So what he would end up with, unlike a conventional copper plate, he ended up with a thing that basically worked like a rubber stamp. The bits that you want to print are sticking up. So then all you've got to do is smear the ink across it. How would you do that? You know, you have good ways of doing that. Put it into the press and print it, and it stamps itself, and you come out with probably in a sort of brown ink in this case. If you look around the edge where you've got the page number 3 and you've got the outline round the frame, there's a sort of darkish brown colour. That's probably the colour of the underlying ink. Having printed the page like this, Blake would then colour it in watercolour. And of course, one consequence of that is that every copy of every illuminated book he produced is unique. No two are the same. So much work, but on the other hand, fantastic opportunity for changing the look of the books. We'll see some different ones later on, but it gave some scope for creativity because you could change the mood, you could change the lighting, you could change the costumes of the people in pictures, you know. It's a very, very flexible and creative method so that the books stayed alive. And Blake kept many of the plates of these books, these little books of his, throughout his life, and he would produce them to order. He never sold huge numbers of them, but he produced them to order. And they could be adjusted for different clients or for different moods that Blake was in. So there's a tremendous richness there. So his first Blake work really was Songs of Innocence, which you have the title page here, 1789. Coincidentally, of course, it's the same year that the French Revolution broke out, although the book was probably produced before the revolution began. In 1794, Blake decided to expand Songs of Innocence into a much more ambitious two-part work, and it became, with a new title page added, it became Songs of Innocence and of Experience. So the simple Songs of Innocence become Songs of Innocence and of Experience. Showing, you can probably see the little subtitle there, showing the two contrary states of the human soul. So we've got the idea of a polarity, of a contrast or a conflict, a tension within the human nature between these two poles of innocence and experience. And I think it's probably undeniable that when you look at those dates, Songs of Innocence, 1789, Songs of Experience is published 1794. Well, of course, between those two dates, you've had the French Revolution, you've had terror, you've had the declaration of war between Britain and France. European war has broken out. The whole scene of the world has become much darker, which I think explains to some extent, you know, we can't be simplistic about these things, but to some extent it explains the change in mood. But let's look, since we've got them here, let's look a little bit more closely at those images. Songs of Innocence. You have a tremendous exuberance. The letters of the word songs are flourishing, they're turning into plants, leaves, flourishing in all directions. You've got a haloed angel leaning against the shaft of the letter N there. You've got a tree with what look like golden apples. Quite amusingly, because when you look closely at the apples, you begin to see the O of as being another apple, and you realise, oh, it's not an apple, it's a letter. Then you've got the beautiful cursive letters of innocence, and there's another figure, possibly an angel, with playing a pipe, leaning against the eye of innocence. You've got this tree at the base with, is it a creeper or is it a serpent coiled around it? Hint of the Garden of Eden and what went wrong, perhaps in the background, but only a hint. The two delightful little children, a boy and a girl, being shown a book by their, I suspect a nurse, but perhaps mother. And I think that's, if you like, that's the model of how this book is to be used. It's primarily seen as a book for children, though Blake would always write with hidden depths for adults as well. But it's a delightful, happy picture of suggesting a sort of golden age, I think, with whatever slightly darker hints there may be. Okay, contrast that. Here's Songs of Innocence and of Experience. The predominant, although we've still got the the flourishes and the nice sort of creative fluency of the word song is at the top, and we've got the bird flying up. But other than that, the dominant image here really is of flame. And at the bottom, well, there's no question in terms of traditional iconography, who have we got here? We've got Adam and Eve cast out of paradise. I think it would be simplistic to think of innocence and experience simply as childhood and adulthood, but obviously there is an element of that about it, in the sense that with the ending of childhood, one is cast out from an innocence of vision into a world that is darker and more threatening, and you can see that they've got these rather scanty leaves around their middles, no doubt echoing the aprons of fig leaves, which according to Genesis they made when they lost their innocence. So this is the darker side of the vision, and the interesting thing is that Blake, rather than simply scrapping the Songs of Innocence, Blake keeps it and puts it together with the Songs of Experience. So, and we'll look at those in more detail a bit later on. You've got this sense of polarities, of alternative possibilities between which human beings move, and the book dramatises them. Now, Blake was always, it seems, interested in the idea of contrasts, antagonisms, tensions, what he called contraries. And this, I'm giving you a quote here from a later work, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which we'll look at later on. And there, Blake says, without contraries is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. Very interesting. He doesn't suggest really that we should somehow strive towards a one-dimensional or a single flavoured version of existence. There's that sense that it's essential to the human condition that we live between these polarities, that we have access to both of these, and that our nature somehow comes from living between the poles of this kind of emotional or moral magnet, if you like, on the stage of which we exist. And Blake is often quite keen on the idea that, for example, anger is better expressed and got out of your system than suppressed and held down. We must accept our nature as living in a world of contraries and work with that. You can see that there's a strong sense of dynamism about all this, and here's another of Blake's little aphorisms, again from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He said, energy is eternal delight. And I think by eternal he doesn't mean going on continuously. He means energy is delight in the spiritual sense. What is eternal is that which belongs in the spiritual realm, which is also the human realm. But Blake was very emphatic in many of his writings that the way we experience the world is not to do with our simply passively responding to an external world. The way we experience the world is to do with us and who and what we are. And so again, I'll give you another aphorism from The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. He says, if the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. I don't know if it's necessary these days to kind of apologise for the repeated use of the word man, but of course he means humanity collectively. Plenty of women in Blake's work. If the doors of perception were cleansed, interesting. How can we cleanse them? well, of course, Aldous Huxley took that quotation and used it for his experiences with mescaline, didn't he? Which is perhaps one way. But I think Blake much more had in mind changing our way of seeing the world from within by imagination, by compassion, sometimes I think by anger at injustice or cruelty or things which are wrong. I mean, Blake was not without anger by any means, but he believed in expressing it and then letting it go, as we shall see. So, really what he's saying is that the world is actually much richer than we think it is. There is vast richness and depth out there, but very often there is something in us which prevents us from seeing it. And of course, one of the approaches to this that Blake takes is his interest in childhood, his belief that children have a clearer vision which has not been narrowed by convention and by the wrong kind of teaching. But he was also interested in other thinkers who had come before him and had tried to widen the doors of perception by means of vision and seeking spiritual pathways. The two who were probably most important to him were these two, Emanuel Swedenborg and Jacob Boehmer. Swedenborg was the Swedish scientist who, partway in the middle of his life, had an unexpected spiritual revelation, began to see visions, was, he believed, or he claimed, taken on guided tours of heaven and hell by angels, and wrote a very interesting book called Heaven and Hell, which Blake kind of partly agreed with and partly hated, so we'll come to that again later. Swedenborg, a visionary who had also come and spent a good slice of his later life in England, interestingly enough, but had also taught, in the light of his visions, that the Bible was to be interpreted not literally, in other words, not as a book of history, but symbolically. That everything in the Bible for Swedenborg had an inner spiritual meaning. You could read it as a kind of imaginative allegory. So that rather than just taking it as history, you could read the story of the Tower of Babel wasn't an account of some people at a certain date building a huge tower which archaeologists might one day dig up somewhere in the desert. You know that the whole story is in every detail an account of human pride and arrogance, and Swedenborg would kind of deconstruct the whole story so that each bit, the stones mean one thing and the cement means something else, and so on. But basically the whole of the Bible was seen as parables. And this meant, of course, that you could picture the stories in the Bible, you could look for meanings in them, you could apply them to your own life. It was perhaps a way of rediscovering the visionary dimension of Christianity and the Bible, and its poetic dimension, for an age which had become very, very rationalistic and wanted to see everything in a very materialistic way. So Swedenborg rediscovered, if you like, for Blake, the imaginative dimension of the Bible, and the way that it could be seen as a universal poetic book about every aspect of mankind. Now Swedenborg, of course, had left behind him, first of all, a wing within the Church of England, which had subsequently split off and become the Swedenborgian Church. When I first came to live in Manchester in 1971, there was the new church house, which had a Swedenborgian chapel and a Swedenborgian bookshop. I'm pronouncing Swedenborgian, not Swedenborgian, because I was lucky enough towards the end of my academic career to supervise a PhD on Blake by a Swedenborgian clergyman, because there were still congregations following Swedenborg's teachings in the north of Manchester, and he always called it Swedenborgian. So I guess if anybody knew, he knew, so that's how I'm pronouncing it, although most people would say Swedenborgian. Anyway, Swedenborg's followers had formed a breakaway church from the Church of England. I don't know whether, did anyone here know people, or anyone here brought up as a Swedenborgian? Yes? Yeah?
I wasn't brought up, but I lived in London very close
Yes.
to Swedenborg Church.
Yes, and of course there's still New Church House in Bloomsbury, isn't there? Yeah. Now, when the breakaway Swedenborgian church was set up, we know that Blake's parents joined it briefly because their name's on the list. So obviously his ideas had a big input for Blake. But Blake also quarrelled with him, and when we move on to the matter of heaven and hell, we'll be able to discuss what they were quarrelling about. I should say the quarrel took place long after Swedenborg had died, but it was a posthumous argument with his books, really. Jakob Boehme, German mystic, again a visionary who wrote a number of beautiful books which drew quite deeply actually on traditions of alchemy, but really offered a mystical Christianity. I don't know if you've ever seen the law translation of Boehme's works, but Boehme's books were illustrated with these wonderful diagrams, which, where you could unfold layers. You would have, for example, a drawing of the human figure, and when you opened up a layer of the paper, you would find diagrams of the stars and planets underneath, and diagrams showing the hierarchies of angels and all kinds of things. So Boehme was also a thinker who saw worlds within worlds and sacredness within the material world that we normally live in. And Blake draws on both Swedenborg and Boehme. They're part of his tradition. He argues with both of them, but he also draws on their works. Along with this element of the visionary and the mystical, of course, it has to be said that Blake was politically radical. As we'll see later, he was horrified by the plight of the poor in his lifetime, and of course not much has changed there, probably. He hated warfare and cruelty. He was very much in favour initially of the French Revolution, and actually wrote an epic poem, originally intended to be in 12 books, but he crossed out the one of 12 and made 2 books after a while, and then we all start these things ambitiously, don't we? But he wrote a tremendous visionary poem in praise of the French Revolution, which he saw as a liberating force until it degenerated into European warfare. We will always find this element of political radicalism in his work, and this belief that people need to think for themselves, that they need to interpret things for themselves, they need to see things for themselves, they shouldn't accept received opinions simply handed down. And perhaps a central way of summing it all up was that Blake frequently used the phrase Jesus, the imagination. In a certain sense, he identified Christ with the human imagination. I think one way of approaching an explanation of this would be to say that the imagination is what sees possibilities. Our imagination is what sees the humanity in other people. It enables us to put ourselves in someone else's place. Without imagination, the world is fixed and essentially dead. For Blake, therefore, imagination within each of us is the liberating, resurrecting force. It's the divine principle within the human being, or the central divine principle within the human being anyway. And so he will frequently talk about Jesus, the imagination. And to the extent that we use our imagination, we are beginning to participate in the full divine humanity. And again, the divine humanity is another favourite phrase of Blake's. So an intimate connection, therefore, between creativity and the spiritual divine reality which we would like to realise in ourselves. The imagination is the divine element within us. And of course, if you apply the imagination, you then go further and say, well, everything's divine. But one of the key points, as we'll see, really, as will emerge, is that there is no one fixed interpretation of what Blake thought about any given thing. What Blake thinks about things is basically that we should consider them, we should use our imaginations, we should take a creative and flexible and compassionate approach to them. He does not have a philosophy that we can spell out, because precisely if it was spelled out definitively, it would immediately become boring and dead. So Blake challenges us, he throws things at us, he shows us things. Many books have been written trying to say this is what Blake's philosophy was. You know, once we've got it all sorted out, we can read this book and we'll know exactly what he thought. It doesn't work like that. It's flexible and alive at every point. I think we'll have a break in a moment, but I'll just give you some key quotations, and you may find these quotations either disturbing or possibly reassuring. I find them quite reassuring. This is something Blake wrote quite late in his life, towards his death in 1827. He says, "You say that I want somebody to elucidate my ideas," which of course is what all critics try to do. "But you ought to know that what is grand is necessarily obscure to weak men. That which can be made explicit to the idiot is not worth my care." Sometimes that's a slightly shaming thing to read, you know, and you say, oh dear, am I the idiot? Well, okay, maybe I'm the idiot. The wisest of the ancients considered what is not too explicit as the fittest for instruction, because it rouses the faculties to act. So basically what he's saying is, think about it. Play with it. See what you can find in it. Don't expect me to write an encyclopedia telling you exactly what's what. And of course Blake changed his mind about all sorts of things in his lifetime. Anyway, one of the great proverbs of hell in the Marriage of Heaven and Hell, as we will see, is a proverb that says, "The man who never alters his opinion is like standing water and breeds reptiles of the mind." So it's fine to change your mind. That's all right, you know, it shows you're still alive. There's still somebody in there, you know. We haven't turned into a fossil. So it's fine. Think about it, play with it, look at it, imagine, you know. Don't necessarily try and pin it down. Here's another nice one. "To me, this world is all one continued vision of fancy or imagination." Interesting thought. Even the brain scientists tell us that what we see isn't just our sensory input by any means. As Coleridge said, we half create and half perceive. As we are, so will our world be. And I'm hoping I've got another of my favourite quotes. Have I got it? we'll get there. Yeah, here's another nice one. Everybody does not see alike. To the eyes of a miser, a guinea is more beautiful than the sun. There we are. Don't get any comments needed on that, really. It's pretty clear. This is the one, my goodness, the number of times I've painfully thought about this comment of Blake's that I'm going to show you. Motorways, HS2. The tree which moves some to tears of joy is in the eyes of other only a green thing. How about that? This ought to be, placarded on the outside of every planning department. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
That's a motto for the ecologists, I think. Well, Blake was the quintessential Londoner. I don't know if he ever went north of London at all, as far as I can tell. He certainly never got as far as Birmingham. He did spend 3 years at Felpham in Suffolk? Surrey? No, Sussex, sorry. Sussex. You can see I'm a northerner, I get these counties mixed up. Sure, yes, and he was working for William Haley, an aristocratic patron, and he had a cottage at Shoreham, and of course the cottage is now owned by the Blake Society, Blake Trust. It wasn't a happy time. Blake, as you might already have deduced, Blake was not the sort of person who really liked being told what to do by rich patrons, and he did some good work there, but it all went horribly wrong. He had a quarrel with a drunken soldier who wandered into his garden and ended up being accused of treason because he'd said, "Damn the king and all his soldiers," when he put the chap out. He wouldn't do the hack work that William Haley wanted him to do, so his 3 years at Shoreham were not a big success. And he returned to London rather disillusioned. However, it's nice to record that he wasn't ultimately without disciples, as tends to happen with remarkable artists and so on who don't teach formally. In his old age, he suddenly acquired a group of disciples, pupils really. The most notable of his disciples of his old age, who really worshipped him and treated him as what we would now call a guru, was Samuel Palmer, of course. There we are, there's a nice one of those wonderful images by Palmer. I mean, Palmer called him the interpreter and said his house was the house of the interpreter. And of course that comes from Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. The house of the interpreter, where all these riddles and proverbs and biblical texts are explained by the wise man. So Blake was the interpreter, and Samuel Palmer was his disciple and learned about how to be an artist, how to cultivate the attitude of the artist, how to transform the observed world into vision. I'm sorry, always when you blow these pictures up, they get a bit sort of, you need to see the picture as it is on my laptop, it's so much more vivid. They get diluted by being expanded. Maybe you come and have a look afterwards on the screen, you can see how intense that is. But of course in the Ashmolean they've got quite a collection of Palmer's work. Well, we wouldn't have that really, not of that individuality without Blake. We have Blake to thank for the development of Palmer. Edward Calvert, less well known but a wonderful artist. Fantastic woodcuts of Calvert. Images really of paradise. Again, one of that group of young artists. John Linnell, another one, less well known perhaps. At the end of his life, Blake found a patron in the form of a gentleman called Thomas Butts, who commissioned him to do a whole series of both prints and also wonderful illustrations to Dante. There's a novelist who was descended directly from Thomas Butts. I think his granddaughter called Mary Butts. Anybody know Mary Butts? Quite an interesting novel. She wrote novels about the Holy Grail and things in the 1920s. Anyway, okay, so Thomas Butts. Butts financed the last major work of Blake's life, which he was still working on when he died. And that was his illustrations to Dante's Divine Comedy. Blake actually taught himself Italian, or a certain amount of Italian, in order to do this. And he produced something like 100 large, I mean these are big kind of A3 size illustrations to Dante, going through almost the whole poem. And the intention ultimately was to have these engraved. He didn't live long enough to do this, and it wasn't done, so we simply have these beautiful watercolours, strange but beautiful. And incidentally, you look at these and you think, well, is Blake's drawing not terribly competent and so on, but you can equally find wonderful anatomical drawings and so on, not to mention that fantastic self-portrait at the beginning, which demonstrates that Blake actually could draw conventional anatomy and realism as much as he wanted. But he chose to distort, if that's the word, to bring out visionary and sometimes almost medieval quality. I think those animals have got, there's almost something of medieval misericords or corbels about them, isn't there? They are deliberately distorted but deeply expressive. And, there's another picture done for Thomas Butts as an individual freestanding entity. The Elohim creating Adam is the usual title given to this. And, we could talk all day about the interpretation of this single picture, really. What's going on here? I don't think I'm going to embark on that at the moment because there's so much to say about it, but an extraordinary image. Is this the one that you mentioned on St. Paul's, or is that a different one? You said there was an image projected onto...
I think it was the Ancient of Days.
Oh, it was the Ancient of Days, okay. So, yeah, this is a wonderful... This is the creation of Adam. And not... It's sometimes billed as kind of God creating Adam, but strictly, Blake's own title for it was the Elohim creating Adam, which is interesting because it suggests that he knew some Hebrew, and he also knew that there were different aspects or different versions of God in the Hebrew scriptures, depending on the name which is used. And Elohim is a particular aspect of God which is involved in the creation of multiplicity and the world, the fragmented world as we know it. And there's Adam. Both God and Adam appear to be suffering at the moment of creation. Adam has a worm or a serpent wound around him, presumably because his physical body is the sign that he will die. We don't seem to have the conventional fall here. We have the body has fallen already. We have a stormy sea underneath. He might be lying on a rock, but it appears to be a stormy sea beating on it. The creation is presented here as a moment of horror, really, or something deeply, deeply disturbing. And the Lord appears every bit as anxious as Adam, and not looking at Adam, but looking up elsewhere. I don't know, I mean, you can't have a definitive interpretation of this, but my goodness, what a vision, what a vision. Incredible. 1827 Blake died, and in fact that picture of God with the compasses, which we think of as the Ancient Days, was the very last thing that he did. He printed several versions of this, but the last thing he did on his deathbed was to colour one of those engravings with watercolour, the cut of God with the compasses inscribing the circle of the universe. He coloured that in, and that was his last act before he died. He threw it from him, according to Frederick Clayton, and said, "There, it is done, I can do no better." And we still have that copy. It's in Manchester, delighted to say. And he's buried, of course, in Bunhill Field, along with other dissenters. Who else is there? I think Milton is there, isn't he? And I think Defoe is buried there as well. This is the stone that was fairly recently put there by the Blake Society because there was no top stone. And I think it's one Catherine's there too, though she's not mentioned on that stone. And they chose this very aptly, this quotation: "I give you the end of a golden string, only wind it into a ball, it will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall." Very interesting, because again it's slightly teasing, isn't it? It's the end of a golden string, and of course that suggests what Ariadne's thread as the guide to the labyrinth. It suggests something that you've got to wind up for yourself. It's not handing you. He doesn't say, "I'm handing you the key on the plate." He says it's the end of the string. Now you've got to do the work, which is lovely, really. And we'll stop and give you a little break. And here's a final image. Just this is, again, I think a sort of self-portrait. It's actually Loss, the blacksmith from Blake's epic poems, but it's the creative artist. And you'll notice that his tongs are very much the same shape as the famous compasses, which God holds, and which Newton, as we know from the Paradoxy sculpture at the British Library, also holds to measure. But in the other hand is the hammer. So you've got the precision and you've got the force. And you've got characters bearing the sun and moon at left and right, stars in the middle, and you've got an extended version of Stonehenge. So it's also very British in a way. Again, you could spend a whole day discussing what's in that picture. You know, there's so much there. Well, enjoy it, think about it, and don't expect a definitive answer. You know, that which can be made explicit to the idiot is not really my case, so we're not going to get answers. We'll have a break, shall we? Well, should we have 10 minutes?